There's one thing that no one told you, that no one can put into easy words, but you've felt it. At some point in your life you felt it, that strange feeling of explaining who you are to people who will never understand, to justify his silences, to translate your pain into a language that fits in the heads of those who have never gone through what you went through. To try, with all your energy, to make someone see what is inside you, as if your existence needed approval to be real. And you tried. God knows you tried. You've chosen the right words. You have waited for the right moment. You took a deep breath, organized your thoughts, and when you opened your mouth to finally be understood, what you found on the other side was emptiness. Or worse, it was a trial disguised as advice, a misunderstanding disguised as care, an abandonment disguised as normality, and you went back inside yourself, once again, carrying everything that didn't fit in the conversation. This is the silent weight of a soul that was born different, no better, not superior, different, with a depth that scares ordinary people, not because they are evil, but because true depth always causes estrangement, always. From the earliest times, those who felt too much, who saw beyond, who carried within themselves a world that the outside world could never contain, they have always walked alone along long stretches of the road. But what no one told you is that this isolation is not punishment, it's preparation. What no one has told you is that there is a moment, unique, silent, almost imperceptible, when something changes inside you. A moment when you stop explaining yourself. Not out of pride, not out of anger, not because I gave up on people, but because something inside you has finally understood that your story doesn't need a narrator, your soul needs no defender, and your life doesn't need approval to move forward. And when that happens, everything changes. Spiritually, everything changes. It's not a change that you can show someone. It's not a change that appears in a conversation or in a post. It is a change that happens in the deepest layers of your being, in the parts of you that never had a name, in the parts that you hid in shame and that now begin to breathe with a freedom that you never imagined possible. I know you got here carrying something heavy. Maybe it's the weight of having loved too much and received too little back. Maybe it's the weight of being misunderstood by people you thought knew you. Maybe it's the weight of a version of you that was left behind, that died at some point without anyone holding a funeral, without anyone recognizing what was lost. But you are here, and that in itself says something about who you are. The Holy Scriptures, in their oldest and purest wisdom, record a pattern that repeats itself in every story of true transformation. Before the ascension, there is the desert. Before the voice, there is silence. Before the new name, there is the death of the old. Jacob did not become Israel without first fighting in darkness. Joseph did not arrive at the palace without first passing through the well and the prison. David was not anointed king before he spent years unseen, forgotten, playing his harp for the sheep while his brothers were called to glory. You're not late. You're in the process. And this process has a mark that only those who are inside it can recognize. It's the fatigue of explaining yourself. It's the exhaustion of trying to make the world understand what's inside you. It's the silent pain of realizing that no matter how many words you use, there's a part of you that just doesn't fit into ordinary conversations. And that's exactly there, in that pain, in that tiredness, in that feeling that you're alone in a place that no one else can reach. That's exactly where liberation begins. Not with noise, not with confrontation, with silence, with an inner decision that no one will witness, that no one will applaud, but that will change the course of everything. What you're about to hear isn't advice. These are not strategies. These are not steps to follow. What you're about to hear is a mirror for that part of you that already knows, that has always known, but that was still waiting for permission to fully exist. You no longer need this permission. When you stop explaining yourself, something old in you finally rests. and something new, something that has been waiting patiently in the shadows of your own soul, begins to be born. This video is for you, to that part of you that survived it all, for that part that still believes, even when it doesn't know what anymore, for that part that, in the midst of the fatigue of being misunderstood, still carries a flame that the wind has not extinguished. Stay with me, because what comes next is going to touch something inside of you that has been waiting to be touched for a long time. The pain of those who always needed to justify themselves to exist. There is a pain that has no name. It's not the pain of an obvious loss. It's not the grief that everyone recognizes. It's not the wound that appears on the skin for others to see and understand. It is a pain that lives within, in the deepest layers of the being, in a region where words rarely manage to reach. It is the pain of those who have spent their entire lives trying to explain themselves in order to exist. From those who learned very early on that simply being was not enough. That it was necessary to justify each feeling, translate each silence, defend each choice, as if existence itself were an argument that needed to be overcome. You know this pain. You don't have to pretend you don't know. Maybe it started in childhood, at that moment when you felt something much deeper than the people around you could follow. And when you tried to express it, you heard, "You're exaggerating," or "Stop sensitivity," or simply a silence that said, more clearly than any words, that what you felt was too much, was inadequate, was inconvenient for the comfort of others. And then you learned. He learned to decrease. He learned to edit. You learned to present a version of yourself that was more palatable, easier to swallow, less disturbing to those who couldn't stand the intensity of what you carried inside. But there is something that no one told you at that moment, that every time you diminished yourself to fit into the space that others offered you, a part of you died in silence. Not dramatically, not visibly. It died slowly, like a flame that is being stifled by lack of air. And you kept working, you kept smiling at the right times, you kept answering questions with the expected answers, but inside there was a void growing, a void that no approval could fill, because approval is not the same as recognition. Being accepted is not the same as being seen. The human being who needs to justify himself to exist lives in a constant state of internal judgment. Even before anyone says anything, he has already anticipated the criticism, he has already prepared the defense, he has already rehearsed the explanation. It is a tiredness that does not appear in the body, that is not detected in any examination, but that corrodes the soul in a way that few can describe. It is the fatigue of always being on trial, always on the defensive, always needing to prove that what you are has value, that what you feel is legitimate, that what you think deserves to be heard. And the cruelest thing about this dynamic is that it becomes invisible. You yourself fail to realize that you are doing it. It becomes automatic. It becomes instinct. You start a sentence and insert the justification in the middle of it. You make a decision and prepare the argument before anyone asks. You exist in permanent defense mode, like a soldier in a war that has never been officially declared, but that happens every day, in every conversation, in every relationship. Scripture speaks of a man named Job, a man who lost everything. And that, in the midst of his pain, he was surrounded by people who tried to explain the inexplicable, who tried to justify his suffering using their own limited categories. And Job, in the midst of all that, kept crying out, not for people, to God, because he understood in a certain depth that no human being would be able to contain what he was experiencing, that there was something in his experience that transcended any human explanation. And that realization, rather than isolating him, is what eventually set him free. because the pain of those who have always needed to justify themselves to exist carries within them a sacred seed. The seed of the realization that you are more than what others can see, more than what words can contain, more than any approval can confirm or any rejection can deny. This pain that you have carried for so long is not weakness. It's the sign that you felt deeper, that you lived with more intensity, that you brought to this world a depth that the world was not prepared to receive. And the fact that you've survived it, that you're still here, still able to feel, still able to seek something beyond the surface, it says something immense about who you are. The pain was not the problem, pain was the map. And now you're starting to learn how to read it. The moment the soul decides to stop begging for understanding, there is a moment. A specific silent moment that is rarely announced and almost never celebrated, but that changes everything. It is the moment when the soul, exhausted from running after something that never comes, simply stops. It does not give up. It doesn't fall apart. With a quiet dignity that surprises even the very person who is living it, it is the moment when you stop begging for understanding. Begging is a strong word. Maybe you don't like it applied to yourself, but think with me. Begging is not just asking for bread on the corner. Begging is putting your need in the hands of someone who doesn't have what you need, and keep coming back, even though you know that the answer will always be the same. It's waiting for someone to give you what they simply don't have the ability to give. It is returning to the same door, over and over again, hoping that this time it will open. And you did it, with love, with hope, with a patience that bordered on the heroic. You returned to the same conversations hoping to be finally understood. You tried in different ways, with different words, at different times, hoping that in one of these attempts something would click on the other side and the person would finally see what you were trying to show. You explained yourself, opened up, made yourself vulnerable, exposed yourself, and many times what you found on the other side was indifference or misinterpretation or advice that revealed that the person hadn't even really heard what you said. And yet, you came back, because the need to be understood is one of the deepest in the human soul. Jung, by diving into the depths of the human psyche, identified that the human being cannot stand the isolation of incomprehension. Not physical isolation, which can even be endured with some tranquility, but the isolation of feeling that no one around you can really touch what is inside you. This isolation is a form of pain that consumes from within, slowly, like rust on metal. But there is a huge difference between the need to be understood and the dependence to be understood in order to exist. The first is human, legitimate, even sacred. The second is a prison. And liberation begins just the moment you realize that you are living in the second category. The moment when the soul decides to stop begging for understanding does not come with fanfare. It doesn't come with a dramatic revelation. It often arrives on an ordinary night, after an ordinary conversation that ended in the same way as all the others. You close a message, or leave a room, or lie in bed after a failed attempt to be seen, and something inside you just settles, like dust that finally stops floating and descends to the ground. And you think, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a strange, almost serene clarity, it's not possible. It is not possible to continue like this. Not because people are bad, not because the world is unfair, but because you weren't made to fit into this weight. You were not made to live on crumbs of partial understanding. You were made for something bigger than that. Scripture records the moment when the prodigal son, at the bottom of his own desolation, had what the text calls entered into himself. He did not get angry. He did not revolt. He came to his senses. He went back inside. And it was on this return to the interior that the journey back home began. The royal house, not the house where he had sought approval, not the home of the friends who had consumed all he had to offer. The Father's house, the home of true identity. To stop begging for understanding does not mean to close one's heart. It does not mean becoming an island. It doesn't mean you'll never open up to anyone again. It means that you will stop putting your peace in the hands of people who do not have the key to it. It means you'll start to distinguish between the people who can restrain you and the people who can't, and you'll stop forcing connections that were never really possible. And when this happens, something extraordinary occurs. The space that was previously occupied by waiting, by the anxiety of being understood, by the constant preparation of explanations, this space begins to be filled by something else, by yourself, by his very presence, by his own fertile silence. And you find that when you stop begging for understanding on the outside, you begin to find something that has always been on the inside, understanding yourself. The death of the old self and the silence that no one sees. There is no real transformation without death. This is something that deep spirituality has always known and that modernity desperately tries to deny. Modernity wants transformation without loss. He wants pain-free growth. He wants the harvest without winter. But the soul knows better. The soul knows that before anything new is born, something old must be left behind. And this leaving behind is called death. Symbolic death, inner death, but real death. And this death is rarely acknowledged, is rarely celebrated. Rarely does someone come up to you and say, "I saw it. I saw that you let something die inside you so that something new could be born." On the contrary, the people around you often don't even realize what's going on. Or worse, they realize that something has changed, but they misinterpret it. They think you got cold, that was distant, that he is angry, that he is being arrogant, because the death of the old self makes no noise. It happens in silence. It happens at times when you are alone. It happens in that moment when you look at an old pattern, an old way of reacting, an old relationship, an old version of yourself, and you just can't inhabit it anymore. Like a garment that has become too small. You try to wear it, but the fabric no longer covers what you have become. The theologian and mystic Paul of Tarsus wrote words that span centuries with astonishing precision. "Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new." But what is rarely commented on this passage is what happens between "it has already passed" and "it has become new." There is a space between these two moments, a space of emptiness, a space that is no longer the old and is not yet completely the new. A space of death and waiting that is perhaps the most difficult and most sacred moment of the entire journey. You can be in that space right now. You may no longer be who you were, but you still don't fully know who you are becoming. It may be that the old relationships no longer fit, but the new ones have not yet arrived. It may be that the old thought patterns no longer make sense, but the clarity of the new has not yet fully set in. This space is scary. It is natural that it scares. Because human beings, by instinct, prefer the known to the uncertain, even when the known is painful. We prefer the family prison to the unknown free territory. And so many people, when they reach this place of death of the old self, go back. They run back to the old patterns, to the old relationships, to the old ways of seeing themselves, not because these standards are good, but because they are known. And the known, as much as it hurts, at least has a name. But you who have come this far have something that prevents you from coming back completely. A perception, a vision that can no longer be undone. It's like when you see something that can't be unseen, when a veil falls and you see a reality that was hidden behind appearances. Once you've seen it, there's no longer any way to pretend you haven't. And this realization, even in the midst of the discomfort of the space between the old and the new, is a sign that the transformation is real, that you're not just going through a phase, it is going through a crossing, a crossing that has a before and after, and the after doesn't look like the before. It can't look like it. The silence that no one sees is the womb where the new self is being formed. Every moment of stillness you experience, every time you resist the temptation to re-explain yourself, every time you leave an empty space where there was once approval anxiety, you are fueling that process. You are giving space for what is being born within you to grow with true roots. The death of the old self is not the end. It is the condition of the beginning. Conscious isolation as a portal of transformation. There is a huge difference between imposed loneliness and conscious isolation. Imposed loneliness is the one that happens when people leave you, when you are excluded, when the world seems to have closed around you without you having chosen it. It hurts with a pain that shrinks the soul. Conscious isolation is something else entirely. It is the deliberate choice to create space between you and the noise of the world. Not out of rejection, not out of fear, but out of a sacred need to hear what can only be heard in silence. Those who are in a real process of spiritual transformation invariably go through periods of conscious isolation. Not because he has become antisocial, not because he hates people, but because profound transformation demands a kind of attention that normal social life fragments. It requires you to stay with yourself long enough to hear what's going on in the deeper layers. But the world doesn't understand that. The world interprets isolation as a problem, as a symptom, as something to be corrected. The people around you may have asked you if you're okay, with that tone that suggests they're worried about your isolation when they're actually uncomfortable with your absence. Because when someone who was always available starts to withdraw, it messes with the systems around. It messes with the role you played. It messes with the expectations they had of you. And you may have felt the pressure to come back, to be affordable, to be present in the way that others needed you to be. And this pressure may have made you doubt your own process. It may have made you think that something was wrong with you, that you were being selfish, that you were being cold. But consider the pattern that Scripture repeatedly reveals. Before every calling there is a wilderness. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness of Midian before he heard the voice at the burning bush. John the Baptist grew up in the wilderness before he began his ministry. Jesus himself was taken into the wilderness for 40 days before beginning his public mission. The desert is no punishment. The desert is school. It is the place where God's voice can be heard because there is no more competition of noises. Your conscious isolation is your desert. It is the space where you are being prepared for something that the hectic life of before could never have gestated. It is the place where illusions fall because there are no longer enough distractions to sustain them, where you see yourself without the makeup of social roles, where you find, perhaps for the first time with this clarity, what exists when you take away everything that is not you. And what is there when you take away everything that is not you? There is exactly you, with his wounds and his gifts, with his fears and his strength, with its shadow, as Jung would call it, and with its light. There is the complete person that you have always been, but who never had enough space to fully reveal themselves, because there was always a lot of noise, always a lot of demand, always a lot of explanations to give and roles to play. Conscious isolation is not forever. It is a portal, not a residence. You enter through it to be transformed, not to hide permanently. And when you leave on the other side, when the desert period comes to an end, you don't leave as you entered. I leave with something that didn't exist before. An inner solidity, a clarity about who you are that does not depend on anyone's confirmation. A peace that is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of oneself. And then, when you go back to the world, you come back different. Not arrogant, not far away, different, with a presence that makes no apologies for its existence, with a calm that needs no explanation, with an identity that does not sway according to the wind of other people's opinions. Conscious isolation was the portal, and you're going through. When you stop explaining yourself, you start belonging yourself. There is a direct relationship that few perceive between the act of constantly explaining oneself and the act of losing oneself. Every time you make an exception in your own truth to fit it into someone's understanding, you give up a piece of yourself. Every time you soften what you think so as not to make you uncomfortable, or exaggerate what you feel to be more dramatic and thus be taken seriously, or diminish what you are to appear more accessible, you distance yourself from yourself. And this distance, accumulated over months and years, creates a chasm between who you are and who you present to the world. Belonging to yourself is one of the rarest experiences that exist. It is not selfishness, it is not narcissism, it is not indifference to others. To belong to oneself is to inhabit one's life from the inside out, rather than from the outside in. It's about making decisions based on what you truly are, not based on what people expect of you. It's feeling what you feel without immediately seeking validation that what you feel is adequate. When you stop explaining yourself, something starts happening that is almost physical in your sense, even though it is completely spiritual in nature. You start to settle down, like a person who finally sits in a chair after hours of standing. There is a relief that goes deeper than the body, a sense that you can finally be who you are without having to manage the world's reaction to it. And with that settlement comes something even more precious. You get to really hear yourself. When you're not constantly looking outward, preparing explanations, monitoring reactions, anticipating judgments, you start to access an inner voice that was there all along, but couldn't be heard in the midst of all that noise. A voice that knows things, a voice that knows the direction, a voice that has answers to questions that you have never been able to answer because you have never been quiet enough to hear it. Jung called this the process of individuation, the process by which a person becomes who they really are, integrating the parts of themselves that have been denied, repressed, or forgotten, and emerging as a coherent whole, not perfect, not without shadows, but entirely, genuinely whole. And there is something that Scripture captures in this process with a beauty that no psychological language can completely overcome. The moment when God asks Adam in the garden after the fall, "Where are you?" It's not a geographical question. It's a question of identity. Where are you in relation to who you are? Are you still in yourself, or did you hide? Most people spend their lives hiding what is too much, hiding what is different, hiding what does not fit. And the constant act of explaining oneself is a sophisticated way of hiding. It's a way of presenting a processed version of yourself instead of showing yourself directly. It is a mediation between you and the world that over time you yourself forget that it is mediation. You start to think that the filter is you. But when you stop explaining yourself, the filter drops, and what appears underneath all that mediation is you, with an authenticity that can be scary at first because you are not used to existing without defense, but which progressively reveals itself as the only form of existence that is worthwhile, the only form that doesn't require you to fragment to survive. Belonging to yourself changes everything. It changes how you speak. It changes what you accept. It changes what you refuse. Change how you love, with a generosity that is no longer desperation disguised as surrender. It changes how you are alone, with a peace that is no longer empty, disguised as independence. You become able to give what you previously did not have to give, because finally, you have yourself. And when you have yourself, you have everything you need to get started for real, the new identity that doesn't need to be announced to be real. There is a temptation that appears at the end of every great transformation. It is the temptation to announce, to let the world know that you've changed, to prove by words or by ostentatious behavior that you are no longer who you were. It is an understandable temptation, human even. You've been through so much, you've transformed yourself in ways that even you can't fully describe, and there's a part of you that wants that to be seen, that wants the people who underestimated you to realize that you're different now, who wants the world to recognize the crossing. But the new true identity needs no announcement. This is the difference between real transformation and transformation performance. The transformation that is real is not announced. She appears. Not because you show it off, but because it is. Like the light that doesn't need to explain that it's light. It simply illuminates. Like the tree that doesn't need to announce that it has deep roots. She simply remains standing when the storm passes and the others topple over. There is a moment in the scriptures that always stops me. The moment when Joseph, after everything he had been through, after the pit, after slavery, imprisonment, betrayals, after all the journey that transformed him from the inside out, reveals himself to his brothers. And what he says is not an accusation. It is not a proof of superiority. It's not a, "I told you I'd get here." What he says is, "I am Joseph, your brother." Simple, direct, no elaboration required, because who he was no longer needed defense. He needed no further explanation. It was just real. The new identity that is born of a profound transformation has this quality. It is simply real. It doesn't need external validation to exist. It doesn't need witnesses to be true. It exists in the depth of your being, anchored in something that goes beyond the opinions, approvals, recognitions that the world may or may not offer. And paradoxically, it is precisely this identity that does not ask to be seen that ends up being seen more than anything you have ever announced. Because people feel the difference between someone who is trying to look like something and someone who simply is something. They feel it in the way you occupy a space, in the tranquility with which you speak, in the absence of the need to prove anything. There is a presence in people who have become real with themselves that has no equivalent in any performance. You stopped explaining yourself. And by stopping explaining yourself, you stopped needing to be understood in order to feel whole. You have discovered that your wholeness does not depend on the look of the other, that your value is not an open-ended question that needs someone's answer to be resolved, that who you are exists with a solidity that doesn't waver when someone can't see you. This is the new identity. It's not rigid, it's not defensive, it's not proud. It is simply firm, like a root that goes too deep to be pulled out by the wind, like a flame that burns in a sufficiently interior place not to be extinguished by external storms. And there is something irreversible in this arrival. There is no going back. Not because you are unable to grow further, but because what you have seen cannot be unseen. What you have become cannot be undone. The death of the old self was real, and the birth of this new self is equally real, permanent, essential. You no longer need to beg for a place in the world. You no longer need to justify yourself to exist. You no longer need to translate your depth into shallow language to be accepted. You can exist whole, at your own pace, in your own silence, in your own fullness, and know that this is enough. More than enough. It is exactly what was always intended for you. The soul that stops explaining itself has not been muted. She has finally learned to speak the language that matters, the language of presence, the language of being. And in that language, every silence is eloquent, every step is a statement, and every day lived from within is a testimony more powerful than any speech could ever be. You've made it this far, not by accident, by fate, and the best is yet to come.